Okay, let's kick this off with, well, probably one of the wildest origin stories in finance. You have to picture this. 2010, there's this programmer, Laszlo Hanyecz, and he uses 10,000 bitcoins to buy 2 pizzas.
Ah, yes, the infamous pizza transaction, the first real-world purchase.
Exactly. And
Oh,
today, that amount of Bitcoin, it's worth hundreds of millions. It's kind of a painful story, really paying a fortune for dinner. But it perfectly sets up our big question today. How on earth did something purely digital, code you can't touch or use for anything physical, get any value, let alone, well, enough value to rival a small country's GDP?
it really is a fascinating economic puzzle. We're dealing with something totally intangible, just software and cryptographic trust that somehow exploded onto the world stage. And to really dig into whether its value is legitimate, we actually need to dust off a pretty old piece of economic theory. We're talking 1912, Ludwig von Mises and his regression theorem.
Mises. Okay, the Austrian economist, always trying to find the logical roots of value. So what's the mission for this deep dive then?
Well, the mission is essentially to put Bitcoin, this 21st century invention, through Mises' century-old ringer. Does it actually meet his fundamental requirement? That any form of money has to trace its value back to some original non-monetary use. Or is Bitcoin such an outlier that it basically forces us to rip out page 1 of the economics textbook and redefine money itself? We're going to use some solid academic evidence to figure this out.
All right, let's start there with the regression theorem itself. Mises wasn't just observing, he was tackling a kind of logical loop, wasn't he? Something rooted in how people make choices, what you call praxeology.
That's absolutely right. Praxeology, the logic of human action, is his starting point. And he saw this circular reasoning problem with money's value. Why is a dollar worth anything today? Because we expect it to be worth something tomorrow. Why do we expect that? Because it was worth something yesterday. It just goes round and round.
Yeah, like chasing your tail, trying to find the first value. So Mises said you have to rewind, go back in time until you find a point before it was money.
Precisely. The theorem insists that the value money has now must connect back, step by step, to a time when the thing itself had what he called objective exchange value, based on a direct practical use. Think about, say, salt, useful for preserving food long before people used it as payment. That's where the word salary comes from, right? Or gold, valued for jewelry way before coins existed.
Okay, so that gives it a real-world anchor. You accept the gold coin, partly because, worst case scenario, you can melt it down, make something pretty. But Bitcoin, well, you can't melt down code. Isn't that a huge problem for Mises' idea, a digital reality he couldn't have foreseen?
That's the absolute core of the challenge Bitcoin presents. Mises was very clear. An object cannot be used as money unless it already possessed an objective exchange value based on some other use. It's a strong statement. But, the principle has shown some flexibility. Look at the euro's launch in 1999. It didn't start from scratch. Its value kind of piggybacked on the existing prices and the trust people already had in the old currencies, the German mark, the French francs, the lira.
Ah, I see. So the euro inherited its value. It didn't need a pre-existing physical use itself. It just needed the memory of the old prices.
Exactly. It leveraged the existing monetary network.
Okay, so we have this rule. Prior use needed, either tangible like gold or inherited like the euro. Then Bitcoin arrives, 2009. Just a 9-page white paper, some open source code. What was its initial non-monetary use, if any?
And that is where the fight really begins. We do have a first recorded price, October 5th, 2009. One Bitcoin was valued at, get this, about 0.000000766, tiny, established on some niche online forum. And that near zero starting point immediately split economists. How do you explain even that tiny value without a prior use? Two main camps emerge.
Okay, what are the two sides?
Well, you have the skeptics, often the more traditional economists. They look at Bitcoin's start and say, look, the value was basically zero. It's pure speculation, maybe the greater fool theory kicking in early. Crucially, they argue, it has no non-monetary consumption use. You can't eat Bitcoin, you can't wear it, you can't build with it. So for them, it flat out violates the regression theorem.
No pizza value, basically.
Intrinsic pizza value.
But then you have the other side. The proponents, the early adopters, the cypherpunks maybe. They must argue the value wasn't about consumption at all.
Exactly. They argue the initial value was entirely subjective, intangible. It was valued, they say, as a tool for testing peer-to-peer networks, maybe a kind of digital novelty or toy for tech enthusiasts and hackers, and perhaps most significantly, as an ideological symbol. A tangible representation of the cypherpunk dream decentralized, trustless money outside the control of banks and governments. That utility, they argue the utility as a proof of concept, as a statement, was its original non-monetary use.
an ideological anchor instead of a physical one. That sets up a real clash. So let's get into that economic smackdown. Who makes the strongest case that Bitcoin is, as you said, a flagrant violation?
Well, critics like William Luther, who's done a lot of work on money history, make a strong case. They really hammer the point. No true non-monetary use means no legitimate Mises origin. Some even label it a Ponzi digital, basically implying its value only comes from new people buying in, hoping to sell to the next person for more. They see it as finding a loophole in Mises's logic rather than fulfilling it.
A Ponzi. That's a pretty serious charge. But wasn't there a historical case that challenged Mises' strict need for a physical anchor, even before Bitcoin?
Yes, and it's a really important historical footnote. Think about Germany in 1923, during the hyperinflation crisis. The old mark was totally worthless. People were using wheelbarrows of cash. They introduced a new currency, the rent mark. Now, critically, it had no gold backing. According to a strict reading of Mises, it should have failed.
But it didn't fail, right? It stabilized the economy. Yeah.
It worked remarkably well, actually. And economists argue it worked because it relied on something intangible. The public's memory of prices from before the hyperinflation, and crucially, trust in the government's promise to maintain stability. It was anchored psychologically, cognitively, not physically. People remembered what bread should cost, and they trusted the new currency would reflect that. This suggests the anchor doesn't have to be a lump of metal. It can be shared belief or memory.
Okay, that Ren and Mark example does seem to open the door for Bitcoin's argument. If trust and memory work then, maybe ideology and network utility can work now. So how do the pro-Bitcoin economists, maybe those associated with the Mises Institute like George Pickering, argue that Bitcoin extends the theorem rather than breaking it?
Their core argument rests on a key distinction. Bitcoin didn't emerge in a vacuum, in a pure barter economy. It emerged into a world already full of money, full of established prices in dollars, euros, yen. So, they argue, the super strict need for a tangible consumption good is less critical, much like it was for the euro piggybacking on the mark and lira. And they emphasize the subjectivist nature of Austrian economics. Value isn't inherent in the object, it's in the minds of individuals. If some people, for whatever reason, testing code, making an ideological point, seeking privacy valued Bitcoin enough to trade something for it, even a tiny amount of fiat currency, then that's enough to establish that initial link.
Right, so the first trade, even for fractions of a cent, anchors it to the existing monetary system. And from there, the regression process can begin.
That's the idea. That first exchange, however small, gives it a non-zero value expressed in existing money, and then yesterday's price informs today's price, and so on.
Okay, but hold on. It still feels a bit like we're bending the rules to fit the outcome. Is this extension just a clever way to save the theory from a modern anomaly? Did anyone try to move beyond just the philosophical arguments and actually test this with, data?
That's exactly where the research went next, because you're right, the philosophical debate can go in circles. We need to see if Bitcoin's actual price behavior fits the theorem's predictions.
So what did the numbers show? How well does this regression idea hold up empirically?
There's a notable study cited from Reddit looking at Bitcoin prices between 2014 and 2019. They ran regression analyses to see how much yesterday's closing price influenced today's closing price. The results are pretty striking. The previous day's price explained 88% of the current day's price variance. That's a correlation coefficient of 0.94 statistically. That's incredibly strong.
Wow, 88%. So today's price is overwhelmingly predicted by yesterday's price. That really does sound like the regression Mises described value carrying over day to day. It's not random, it's sticky.
Exactly. It suggests the market is behaving in that backward-looking way Mises outlined, even for a digital asset. And there's more. The study also looked at supply. We know Bitcoin has that hard cap, 21 million coins eventually, by around 2140, with the issuance rate decreasing over time. This digital scarcity seems to function like physical scarcity in economics.
And the data backed that up too.
It did. They found that even small increases in the Bitcoin supply had a significant impact on price, following classic supply-demand logic. Specifically, a 1% increase in the amount of Bitcoin emitted was linked to a 16% price increase, suggesting the market is highly sensitive to its programmed scarcity. It aligns with Fisher's equation of exchange principles, MVPT.
Okay, so the price follows historical patterns, and it responds predictably to supply changes based on its scarcity. So what's the final academic consensus on Bitcoin versus Mises? Did the theory survive?
The consensus, particularly noted in a 2019 Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics paper, seems to be, yes, it survived, but maybe broadened. The whole debate about needing a tangible versus digital prior use is increasingly seen as, well, maybe missing the point. Bitcoin successfully bootstrapped its value by piggybacking onto existing fiat currencies through exchange. People bought the first Bitcoins with dollars, and crucially, it demonstrates clear utility, especially in places with unstable fiat currencies. Look at Argentina. Reports suggest around 7% of the population use digital assets, finding utility outside their failing local currency.
So pulling it all together, Bitcoin doesn't actually violate the regression theorem. The argument is that it extends it. It found its initial anchor not in gold, but in exchange value against established money, dollars, and in the subjective, maybe ideological or technical, utility perceived by its earliest adopters.
That seems to be the prevailing conclusion from the research examining the theory and the data. The mechanism Mises described still works, it just found a new kind of starting point in the digital age.
Okay, so theoretically, Bitcoin gets a passing grade on this century-old test. But passing an economic theory test is one thing. Becoming actual usable money for everyday people, that's another story. What are the big real-world roadblocks that the sources highlight, keeping it more in the realm of speculation than daily currency?
Yeah, the practical hurdles are still significant. The sources point to several key ones. First, and probably biggest, is the extreme volatility. For something to be good money, its purchasing power needs to be relatively stable day to day. Bitcoin's price swings are just wild. Hard to budget if your digital cash could be worth 20% less tomorrow.
Right, that makes it a tough medium of exchange or unit of account. What else?
Second is government regulation. It's a patchwork globally. Taxes can be complicated. Some countries are hostile, others embrace it. This uncertainty makes businesses and individuals hesitant. Third is scalability. The underlying blockchain technology, while groundbreaking, can be slow and expensive for small everyday transactions compared to, say, Visa or MasterCard. Getting coffee shouldn't take 10 minutes and cost $5 in fees.
And just general adoption, right? Getting enough people to use it.
Exactly. That's the fourth point. Mass adoption. Globally, usage is still quite low, maybe around 4% according to the sources. It needs a much larger network effect to become truly mainstream. And then there's a longer-term, maybe existential threat. Quantum computing. If quantum computers become powerful enough to break Bitcoin's underlying cryptography, well, that could undermine the whole system's security.
That volatility point, though, it seems to loop back to our main discussion. If it's still too volatile to be reliably used day to day, doesn't that suggest its primary utility is still speculation? Does that undermine the idea it has truly established non-speculative utility?
That's a very sharp point, and yes, it raises a serious question. You could definitely argue that. While it passed the initial test of acquiring value via regression, its ongoing struggle with volatility suggests it hasn't fully transitioned from being primarily a speculative asset to being a widely accepted medium of exchange. Its success so far has been heavily defined by price appreciation, which feeds the speculative narrative. So, the real-world obstacles do cast a shadow on whether it has achieved stable, practical utility for the masses yet.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this deep dive up. The big takeaway seems to be that Bitcoin is this really unusual case study, a digital creation that managed to navigate a classic economic theory test, the regression theorem. It did it by anchoring itself initially through exchanges with existing money and through less tangible forms of value, like its utility for tech enthusiasts or its ideological appeal.
That's a good summary. And the implications are potentially massive, right? It challenges our old definitions of what money even is.
Yeah.
It suggests potentially changing the whole financial landscape.
Definitely food for thought. So we'll leave you, the listener, with this final question to chew on. We've argued Bitcoin extends the theorem. It found a way to gain initial value. But the sources also quote the economist Murray Rothbard saying something like, "The success of Bitcoin as money remains to be seen. If money ultimately relies on faith and utility, and Bitcoin's main utility right now still feels largely speculative due to that volatility, what future non-monetary use, what fundamental necessity could truly solidify its value? What could make it indispensable even if the price stopped rocketing up?"
Yeah, think about that. What would be the digital equivalent of salt-preserving food, or gold being universally desired for beauty? What gives it deep, lasting utility beyond just the hope of selling it for more later? That's the question that will likely determine its long-term fate.